What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Carson Wagner Show. For years, you have been told something that sounds like a settled fact. Young voters are overwhelmingly progressive. Every generation moves left. The future belongs to the left. But here's the question that no one really seems eager to answer. What happens if that assumption is actually completely wrong? Because over the last 2 years, multiple data sets have started pointing to a shift, a split, if you will, inside Gen Z that complicates the story. And the people who rely on that narrative don't seem to know what to do with it. Here's the twist. Young women are moving further left. Young men aren't. In some cases, they're drifting the other direction. So the obvious question becomes, why would one half of the same generation move one way while the other half moves another way? Because that doesn't happen randomly. It happens when something deeper changes. And once you see what changed, it raises a second question that's even more uncomfortable. Have we been misunderstanding Gen Z politically this entire time? As always, before we get to it, if you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, turn on notifications, and share with anyone you think might like this episode. All right, so let's start with the data, because if this shift is real, it has to actually show up somewhere measurable. I have to back my claims up. So a 2024 analysis from the Financial Times examined political attitudes among Gen Z across several Western countries, not just the United States, and found one of the largest ideological gender gaps in modern history. In country after country, young women were trending sharply more progressive while young men were either staying moderate or becoming more conservative relative to them. Now, that alone raises a question. Is it just this one data set, or is it showing up elsewhere too? Because if it's only one source, you can dismiss it. That's not very reliable. If it's everywhere, you can't dismiss it. And when you look at Gallup's long-running ideological tracking, you see the exact same pattern, which is just absolutely crazy. Among Americans aged 18 to 29, the share of young women identifying as liberal or with the left has risen dramatically over the last decade. Among young men, that rise is much smaller, and in some cases, it is flat. Which leads us to the next question. What would cause an entire gender gap to widen this fast inside the same generation? You would think we'd all have very similar thoughts and ways of processing things, but apparently that's not actually the case. Generational identity is usually shared. Something has to wedge in between us and push us apart. And that brings us to the first major factor. If young men are drifting politically, it's not because they woke up one day and chose a different ideology at random. That's not how we operate. As a 16-year-old man, living in the world as it is right now, I can confirm that is not the way we operate. It's because the environment they grew up in, or the environment they are currently in, changed. So the real question is, what changed first, politics or trust? According to Pew Research Center, trust in major institutions, especially media, government, and higher education, has dropped significantly among younger Americans over the past decade. Because we've been lied to again and again and again and again and again, and it just keeps coming. And it's coming from both sides. It's not just a Democrat thing. It's not just a Republican thing. Definitely the Democrats and the left in general are more guilty of this than the right, but it's not a one side good, one side bad. Both sides have been doing this to us. The government in general has been doing this to us for a long time. And Gen Z is growing up in a world where it's just an established fact that the media lies to you on a daily basis. If you turn on your TV and you hit CNN, see what's up, they will be lying to you, almost guaranteed. Something will be going on that has someone's political interest somewhere spiked, and that person will be using CNN to lie to you. That's just an established fact. They lied about COVID. They lied about the 2020 election. They're lying about Trump. They're lying about literally everything. And it's not just CNN. It's every major media outlet that is not explicitly conservative. Remember, Conquest's second law of politics, any organization that is not explicitly right-wing will sooner or later become left-wing. So the trust in major institutions has justifiably dropped. But here's the part that matters. Young men report some of the lowest trust levels of any demographic group ever, which raises an obvious question. What happens politically when all that trust collapses? Because when people stop trusting institutions, they don't actually just become neutral. They start looking for alternatives. They start questioning narratives. They start reevaluating assumptions that they held before they lost their trust. Historically, that kind of skepticism tends to push people away from whatever they perceive as the dominant institutional consensus. And that leads directly into another question. Was all of this just about trust, or was something else happening at the same time? Because trust doesn't collapse in a vacuum. And in America, at least, it started collapsing alongside economic pressure. So now we have two pieces of the puzzle. Institutional trust is going through the floor. Young men are drifting politically. But that doesn't explain why the shift is happening now, because institutions have, for the most part, been liars for a very long time. And a lot of institutions have lied to a lot of different people. But we haven't really seen this same split before. So here's the next question. What happens to political attitudes when economic optimism disappears? Now, for young men especially, this is extremely, extremely important. We've seen a little bit of a renaissance in the past few years, as a lot of Gen Z is turning back to more traditional ideals of going out and trying to start a family and have kids and build wealth and live the American dream, just because of they're sick of the chaos and the nonsense that's going on. I know that's what I want for myself once I'm grown up and I have a family and I have a job. But with economic pressure and all sorts of horrible things looming on the horizon, that is becoming more and more difficult. It is unbelievably hard to buy a house. It's hard to pay for college. It's hard to get a job that will actually support a family. And definitely both sides of Gen Z feel like the pool of spouses on the other side is not looking very good. And that's why more and more members of Gen Z, of my generation, are trying to stay single or not get married or just rough it out themselves and go do something else in life without having a family and without having kids. And everything is very complicated. Everything is crazy right now. And we're seeing, obviously, a lot of economic uncertainty. You know, the Social Security is collapsing in the 2030s, and that's obviously looming on the horizon, and that's extremely scary. No one knows what's going to happen. Gold and silver, the investing markets are all over the place. Stuff is just wild right now. Economic uncertainty is extremely, extremely high. That makes things difficult for young men who want to go out and start a family and get a good job and get a good college degree and buy a house and live the American dream. The Harvard Youth Poll in 2023 found that a majority of young Americans feel financially insecure about their future and pessimistic about achieving long-term financial stability. That alone is extremely significant. But here's the follow-up question. When people feel locked out economically, where do they actually turn politically? Research from Pew and Brookings suggests that economic pessimism often correlates with increased openness to nationalism, protectionism, and anti-globalization arguments. People just aren't feeling that generous. They're not feeling that happy about the state of the world, and so they kind of close themselves off, and they say, no, we're not doing this anymore. Not automatically conservative. This doesn't automatically make them a conservative, but it often helps them overlap with conservative messaging. So now we have another layer: lower trust in institutions, lower economic optimism, and greater openness to alternative political frameworks. So that raises the next question. If these forces were enough to shift attitudes, why didn't they shift everyone the same way? Because they didn't. Young women moved further left and young men didn't. They moved further right. So what explains the difference there? Because that's really, really mystifying if you actually think about it. At this point, the obvious explanation would be culture. But that actually opens an even bigger question to answer. Have the cultural environments shaping young women and young men become completely different? College enrollment, according to the National Center for Education Statistics data, has increasingly skewed female for years. A growing number of young men are forming their political identities outside of traditional academic institutions. They're listening to podcasts, they're watching YouTube channels like this one, and they're doing all sorts of things that are not really viewed as the traditional or the classic way to form your political opinions. They're not getting them from their parents. They're figuring them out by themselves. Not that that's entirely a good thing. In a lot of ways, it's a bad thing. And I think, which I'll talk about in a second, I think a lot of that has led to the creation of the new right, which is this crazy part of the conservative movement that I don't support and I'm not on, and I want to make that completely clear. But it's a very fascinating phenomenon. We are going to talk about that in just a second. But a growing number of young men are forming their political identities outside of traditional paths. So here's the other part of this that I want to talk about. A lot of you will know that I am not on the new right. I don't support figures like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or Nick Fuentes or Megyn Kelly or Marjorie Taylor Greene, Rand Paul, Thomas Massie. I oppose all those people, and I think a lot of them have good opinions on some things, but for the most part, their opinions on foreign policy and on trade and on what Trump is doing, all of it is completely wrong, okay? Because they belong to this new right, which is this very weird phenomena. It's a split happening within the conservative movement, where we have leaders like Tucker Carlson who talk in very anti-Semitic ways. They talk like Israel is evil, and Israel is the most evil thing there is. They want trade protectionism. They want the government involved in the economy. They don't believe in free markets, which is an obviously traditional conservative given. Okay, they don't believe in free speech. They think people should be canceled or shut down. Tucker Carlson won't say that, but some of the others will. And they platform people like Nick Fuentes or Daryl Cooper who deny the Holocaust. And they say that Hitler was actually a really cool guy and Stalin was a cool guy and young men shouldn't get married and all sorts of just very, very horrible things that obviously have zero truth to them. So what is the new right and why are they cropping up like this? And why are they call themselves conservatives, but they're not actually conservatives, and they position themselves within the conservative movement. And all they're doing is creating the split in the conservative movement. I think what we've already talked about in this episode can answer the question. If you have your own opinion on why the new right is forming, put it down in the comments below because I would love to hear it, and I will respond. I read all the comments and I get back to as many as I can if they're civil and if they engage politely and try to actually foster dialogue and growth instead of just, attacking me for something I didn't say or doing ad hominem or whatever it is. So don't do that. But if you have thoughts, put them down in the comments below because I would love to hear them. I think the new right has sprung up from a mixture of two things operating at once. And obviously, at the deepest level, all of the things I've already mentioned in the episode are contribute to why the new right is who they are and why they're cropping up at the conservative movement when they are. But there's two things. There's two really, really big things. You'll notice that the new right is almost completely made up of young men online that are following podcasters like Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes and Megyn Kelly, and they support people in Congress like Rand Paul and Thomas Massie. They oppose Marjorie Taylor Greene. They oppose people like Ted Cruz who support Israel. Okay, they hate Israel. They've got an obsession with Israel that is just beyond me. I don't understand that at all. I think Israel is just another country. They're no different from Hungary or Kazakhstan or whatever. And I think there are some other countries that they could do a lot better to focus on, like Russia, China, Iran, Ukraine, etc. But they hate Israel with a passion, and they're very obsessed over all that. So how did all these young men get kind of drafted into the new right, and why are they part of our movement now? I think the answer is obviously all the things I've already stated, and the fact that the left has increasingly alienated these young men, and then the right has they've come over to the right, and the right has completely blundered. The right has tried to catch them and be like, yeah, come over here, guys. We've got everything that you want. And then they have completely destroyed, okay? Because the young men are looking for something specific. So the young men look at both sides of the political movement. They go, well, we've got the left, and the left is what the left is. They're a bunch of absolute insane, like psychopaths who kill people like Charlie Kirk and demonize people on social media, and they want us all dead, and they hate us. And they're like, that's disgusting, and that's foul. And the things you support are like horrible. I don't want to support that. And, I understand this being a young man. I don't want to support any of that. And a lot of these young men look at it like, okay, I'm not going to be on the left. Now, this should theoretically drive them into the arms of the right, but it doesn't actually drive them into the arms of the right. Surprisingly, it does the exact opposite, because they look at the right now and they're like, okay, what do you guys have to offer that the left does not have to offer? And the right just completely blunders it. We just completely blunder it because we have lost our Christian foundations and we don't understand what it is that these young men actually want. They want purpose, they want meaning, they want belonging, and they want actual justice. They're sick of Democrats getting prosecuted for all the crimes they do and nothing actually happening. They're sick of Republicans being prosecuted and nothing actually happening. Republicans who have committed crimes. They're sick of criminals getting off the hook. They're sick of streets in downtown San Francisco being covered with syringes and homeless people and trash. They're sick of not being able to afford a house and not being able to raise a family in America and in a lot of states. They're sick of, joining up to be police officers, joining their local police department, and every single day being in fear for their lives because if they just happen to pull over and, somehow do something make the slightest mistake to a black person, they might be accused of racism, tried, and just sent to prison for the rest of their lives, like Derek Chauvin. So they're looking for safety. They're looking for purpose. They're looking for belonging, and they're ultimately looking for Christ. They're looking for God, and that much is absolutely clear. God created them with a purpose. God created them with inward desires, and then they expect the right to fulfill those desires. They expect the right to encourage their manliness and their quest to try to go out and seek justice in the world. And the right doesn't do that. The right is kind of like an extremely pseudo-Christian conservative atmosphere because the right now is just a shadow of what it used to be because we've abandoned our Christian roots. And so we need to go back to those. And then once the young men, they walk in the door and they go, there's power here. There's actually something here. And I want this. This is what the left didn't have. And then they become part of the conservative movement. So they come into the door of the conservative movement. And the conservative movement does not have what they want. So they turn around and they look at the new right, which is technically part of the conservative movement. And the new right says, you know what, screw everything, forget everything, no immigration, no foreign policy. We're just cutting ourselves off from everybody. We're trade protectionism. We're having as much government control as possible to prevent these economic disasters. No one who is here, unless your bloodline has been in America for a certain amount of time, the heritage American movement, can actually be an American. Otherwise, you're not an American citizen or you're not a true American. And they kind of just retreat into this cold, hard shell. And it's very bitter and it's very ungodly and it's not biblical. I think if you're a Christian and you're one of those, you join that movement, you're part of the new right, and you follow people like Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. He absolutely does this. Candace Owens does this. Megyn Kelly, Marjorie Taylor Greene, they all do this. And if you follow people like that, you're essentially saying there's no hope. We're just closing down. We're getting real cold, hard, and bitter, and we're shutting ourselves off from everything. But that's the wrong reaction. That is absolutely the wrong reaction. But I think that's why young men are going into the new right, and I think that's how the new right has formed. Because they look at the left and they say the left is not giving us what we want. They look at the right and they say the right is not giving us what we want. And then they turn around and there's the new right sitting there grinning at them. And so they go and they become a part of this anti-Semitic, honestly more liberal than it is conservative ideology that is slowly poisoning the conservative movement and the future of the conservative movement from within. So obviously it's extremely essential that we combat that. But I think that's where the new right comes from. And at the same time, the left is pampering women. Okay, the left's biggest voting bloc is young women, young unmarried women. If the 19th Amendment was repealed, which I'm not going to talk about that because I don't have time today, but if the 19th Amendment was repealed, the Democrat Party would be over. Okay, the 19th Amendment allows women the right to vote. Young unmarried women are supporting the Democrat Party. They're supporting abortion. They're supporting transgender rights. They're supporting all sorts of really horrible things. And I think it's because they've been fooled in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of them don't actually believe. They're not, their heads, kind of in the clouds, as it is with a lot of people. It's not just young women. Okay. I'm not just saying that about women, but young women, it's just a fact that young women are young unmarried women are the biggest voting bloc of the Democrat Party. So there's that. And the Democrats are managing to pull them in because the Democrats, for the most part, and the left has a very feminine feel, right? Obviously, being soft isn't a bad aspect of a feminine personality, but softness gone too far. And the grievance politics thing and the kind of demonization on social media that happens all the time, that's definitely something that stems from an aspect of feminine personality, and it's twisted beyond recognition. So young women are attracted to that, they like it, and they join the left. And then young men are not attracted to that, they hate it, they've been hurt many, many times. They've been told, if you're a young white man, that you are like the most evil person possible. They can't buy a house, they can't start a family, they can't get a car, they can't go to college, they can't get a good job, they can't do anything. No justice ever comes for all sorts of politicians who commit crimes. And so they come over to the right does not have what they want. They turn around and they see the new right standing there. They see Tucker Carlson standing there and like, you have what I want. I'm not going to get married. I'm going to shut myself off from the world. I'm going to be bitter. I'm going to be hard and jaded. And I'm going to not involve, America in any foreign alliances. I don't want any of that. I want the government to control the economy as much as possible to make it as easy for me to get a house, get a job, get a family, etc. So all of that, I think, is where the new right actually comes from. And that is super, super important to understand if we're going to defeat the new right and take back the conservative movement, which is 100% essential. So all of this leads to one huge final question. Are we watching a temporary fluctuation, or are we watching the beginning of a long-term political realignment? That's not something that just one poll can answer. That's also not something that one video can really answer. But it's something you can see in real time if, like me, you're actually in Gen Z. And I think it's actually happening. I think this is a long-term political realignment, and I think it's very, very big. So here's what I want to know. Does this match what you're seeing around you? Are people drifting right, left, disengaging entirely? Because the data suggests that something is seriously changing. The biggest political shifts often start quietly before anyone in the mainstream narrative is ready to admit that they're happening. So if this is something that you're seeing around you, and if you agree with what I said in this video, leave a comment below and please consider liking and subscribing to support my channel. Obviously, subscribe for more analysis like this. I drop a short every day, a long form once a week, and I go live once a month to answer any questions you guys might have and have very interesting conversations about life and about politics and being in Gen Z and being a Christian at the same time and being behind the scenes of all of it in California, which is enemy territory. I'm Carson Wagner. This is The Carson Wagner Show, and I'll see you next time.